Okay, I like horror movies. Shocking, I know. But over the past month or so, I've been conducting an experiment of sorts. Because I find that, especially when life gets hectic, it's incredibly easy to become somewhat complacent with what I choose to watch, reaching for what is easiest, for what is more generally safe. And obviously, there's a comforting quality to that. Returning to old favourites and checking out stuff that you know you're bound to like is an enjoyable experience. There's value in that, of course.
Not that there's anything wrong with that. Not at all.
There's no sense of discovery there. No charting of brave new worlds. No chance of really experiencing anything new or out of the ordinary. So I made the decision to, well, experiment. Seek out some near-forgotten subgenre or director or era of horror and dive in headfirst. A few cursory Google searches later, I had come across something called V Cinema. Naturally, this caught my interest, and I decided to research a little bit further. Just what exactly is V Cinema? Well, that is V Cinema. And the origins of the style are arguably just as interesting as a lot of the movies themselves. As home video began to become popular in Japan, major studios and independent outfits alike began to take notice, and started producing direct-to-video movies for the home video market in the mid-80s. Doing so had two chief advantages, the first being the comparatively lower cost for producing shorter movies on lower budgets for VHS, and the second being the far more lenient censorship applied to home releases. This perfect storm, combined with the young, creative filmmakers who are using the medium as a no-holds-barred proving ground for their talents, make for some of the most fascinating, bizarre and rewatchable films of the period in Asian cinema. And after dipping my toes into just what V Cinema had to offer, I knew I had to make a video about it. Bring this back into the limelight. And before I knew it, I was down the rabbit hole, with no hope of clambering back up.
We're through the looking glass here, people.
Best just to report back on my findings down here. Now, given that, if I get this video completed on time, and that's a big if, Halloween is right around the corner, you might just be able to find a new favourite amongst these strange, near-forgotten releases. Because, well, no one is really talking about these films. In a preliminary search on YouTube to try and ascertain if anyone had actually covered V Cinema horror before, I could only find the occasional short video recommending some titles from the period, alongside some low quality rips of stuff like Crime Hunter, as well as some videos that weren't actually about V Cinema horror at all. Which, in a sense, was good. I'm not stepping on anybody's toes in making this, after all. But it strikes me as a bit of a shame. A missed opportunity. A blind spot in people's horror knowledge that I'd like to illuminate. And just share some cool and interesting movies. And some not so good ones too, let's be honest, but we'll get there in time. Initially, I had agonised on how to structure this video, which film to start with, how to organise my findings, how best to proceed. But, other than following a very loose chronology, I think we're going to take things easy, loosely, exploring the style as we see fit, getting to grips with each film and pausing it occasionally for brief bits of trivia or history. View this as less of an organised list or deep dive into V Cinema horror than it is me taking your hand, leading you into the dark, seeing just what we can find. Just a quick semantical detail, so we're all on the same page. Technically, not all of these films were V Cinema releases. You see, when releasing low-budget films to home video became popular, a lot of Japan's major production companies began to start their own specialised labels dedicated to producing direct-to-video content. The most famous of which was Toei's own V Cinema label, which kicked off with a bang in 1989's Crime Hunter: Bullet of Rage. Possibly one of the greatest titles for an action movie of all time? They were comparatively late to the party, as we'll see, but V Cinema specifically was a Toei trademark. But in the following years, the name stuck, becoming a catch-all for Japan's home video releases. Plus, let's be honest, it just sounds a little cooler, so the name stays, even if it is technically inaccurate. A word of warning now. V-cinema, by its very nature, thrived on its relative lack of censorship, and as such these movies contain pretty much everything considered deplorable and tasteless that you could possibly imagine. Now, it's not really my responsibility to pass moral judgment on the content of these films. I certainly have opinions on how this stuff is handled, but I shouldn't be considered the arbiter for what is and is not acceptable in cinema. And I think that is ultimately up to each individual to decide for themselves. V-cinema is universally defined by its lack of limitations, that loosening of censorship. It was a primary part of the appeal for filmmakers and audiences alike. And whilst I won't make any sweeping judgments beyond my own personal opinions, I would encourage you to do your own research and assess whether these films are right for you. This is the darker side of cinema, the underground, where pretty much anything goes. Not everything here is going to be for everyone, and that is completely okay. That all being said, I won't start with the real video nasty type stuff that we'll eventually get into. I'll ease us in. Instead, the first film we're going to talk about is biotherapy. This seems the most fitting place to begin, not least because this was my very first brush with V-cinema horror. Yeah, I'd actually seen this before, back in the days where I would troll YouTube late at night looking for low quality rips of 80s slasher movies and weird little anime OVAs. I wasn't really as well versed in horror, so it's sensible to say that I didn't really comprehend exactly what it was I was watching. But I knew that I loved it. And well, how could I not? Biotherapy is a full-throttle mashup of giallo, gore, and sci-fi horror, pulling from European horror cinema just as readily as its immediate contemporaries. The killer is marvellous, easily a highlight of the film, very brutal whilst being greatly stylish. And given the film's length of being only just over half an hour, he wastes very little time before getting down to business.
We're going straight to heaven.
Also, this is probably, in my eyes, one of the most emblematic 80s V-cinema horror titles. Not to suggest that it's the best by any means, but it has pretty much everything that defines this era of V-cinema horror, which makes it a pretty fantastic introduction for anyone looking to dip their toes into the style. Incredibly concise runtime, just over half an hour? Check. Heavy gore effects? Check. A plot that borders on the incomprehensible? Check again. Given how attuned it is to international sensibilities, and it's not a particularly distasteful watch, unless you're adverse to bloody slasher kills, of course. This is a great starting point, enjoyable for newbies and veterans alike. A solid slice of V-cinema goodness. And much the same can be said of our next sci-fi infused horror, Cyclops. It's atmospheric if poorly paced in its first 30 minutes or so, but explodes into gruesome body horror in the last third, with some fantastic, if perhaps too short-lived, practical effect work. The spirit of Brian Yunza's Society distilled into miniature. Fun stuff, could easily recommend. The soundtrack is incredibly varied as well, swinging between calm, ethereal instrumentals to almost funk-inspired bass lines that accentuate the ensuing chaos. But it's that awesome ending that lingers, and should satisfy any 80s horror fan with an admittedly high tolerance for wonky pacing and twisty sci-fi plotlines. Now we're going to jump from Cyclops to Evil Heart, an engaging Kazu Umezu penned slow burner, beautifully shot and drenched in heavy homoeroticism, concluding in a fairly bloody if brief climax. Probably a good sign if I wanted the movie to be longer, but this bad boy barely reaches half an hour. Can't exactly fault it for its efficiency though. As far as I'm aware, this was actually one of, if not the very first V-cinema horror release to hit stores back in Japan in the first days of January 1985. And, well, this tracks. 80s Japan was in a significant period of economic growth that would sustain itself throughout the 1980s and into the very early 90s, with the increase in disposable income available to the average consumer combining with the emergence of popular home video technology to form a new, sustainable, and wildly unique market. Also, although I have to preface this by stating this is pure speculation on my part, the rise in V-cinema horror starting from the mid-80s with titles like Evil Heart, Biotherapy, Cyclops, Guzu, the Thing Forsaken by God, and of course the guinea pig films, can probably be attributed to the fact that horror cinema in Japan had been kind of stagnating in the early half of the 80s. Just a cursory glance at Japan's horror output from the previous year, 1984, with the help of our good friend Letterboxd, is especially telling. Only 16 films, one of which is Godzilla's fairly solid entrance into the Heisei era, but the majority of which is Pinku. Eiji, the Fury of Hell is a pretty clear outlier and is actually directed by Io Heart's own Hikari Hayakawa. 1983 gives us even less to work with, only 10 films. Jump over to 1985, however, and things are looking quite different. Granted, some of this is anime, given that the OVA scene was experiencing similar development to V cinema around this period, and still, some of it remains Pinku. But this is a substantial shift, and one that would keep growing as the decade progressed. Because I don't really want to sidetrack this already gargantuan video, but this is really interesting to me. Looking at the evolution of Japanese horror, there's a sort of gap that occurs between the 70s and the mid-80s. A scarcity in really notable horror heavy hitters, which I realise sounds ludicrous on the face of things, but hear me out. Of course, tracing the general development of horror in Japan after the war is pretty easy. You've got your kaiju movies addressing anxiety surrounding nuclear destruction, stories of vengeful spirits deeply rooted in Japan's theatrical past, the development of the Pinku Igeya in the underground, all fine. In the mid-80s, we have the cinema horror building towards the J-horror boom that would take hold in the West with films like Ring. This is probably all sounding a little familiar to you, but that still leaves us with this strange and fairly mysterious gap in horror. Okay, let's do a thought experiment. Think of the defining Japanese horror movie of the 70s. Okay, now what did you come up with? Without assuming too much, I'm pretty willing to bet it was Housey, right? Maybe an outsider pick like 1971's Demons or a Godzilla entry like Versus Hedorah, all fine picks, but assuming that these are, retrospectively, seen as the most popular and enduring horror films from this period, at least from a Western perspective, that doesn't leave us a lot to work with. Keep in mind that the former two were films from experimental and art house directors, and the latter is a long-running series that had pretty much all but abandoned its horror roots at this point. That's a very long-winded and subjective way of saying that there just isn't as much horror from this period. Not that it disappeared entirely, of course, but the offerings are often more scattershot, found at the margins and difficult to pin down. What's weirder about this is that I couldn't really answer the simple question of why. Well, there's a couple of potential answers to that. The first is that Japan's economy was damaged in the 1973 oil crisis after the Japanese economic miracle of the late 1950s, something the nation didn't really recover from until the economic boom of the mid-80s that likely contributed, in part, to the rise of cinema. The second is that cinema ticket sales began to decline after the 1960s, primarily because of the rising interest in television, which became the dominant format during this period. I think this is why, when you look at the horror from this period, it's either more specialised or underground. It occupies some form of extreme. You've got the more art house horror movies like Demons and Houseu, but this is an era where the Pinku movie also happened to flourish, because they weren't being shown in mainstream cinemas, but, shall we say, dedicated alternative venues. Hell, you don't really even get horror as populist entertainment in Japan again until the late 90s. And I think this, in a nutshell, is why V cinema horror rocked the nation in the way that it eventually did. It was an experience that harnessed then modern popular technologies and was something that could be viewed within the home. Looking internationally to the video nasties in the UK, although the cultural circumstances are vastly different, those videos held a similar appeal. The simple fact of being able to choose and tailor your own watching experience, what to watch and when to watch it. Even with the popularity of television in Japan, that freedom simply wasn't there. So yeah, we're still talking about Evil Heart, aren't we? In saying all that, I don't want to build up Evil Heart into something that it isn't. It's not the best V-cinema joint from this period, nor is it the goriest, the gooeyest, the most memorable, or the most forgettable. It's definitely not even the most infamous from this year alone. But aside from the sheer entertainment value of the thing, it is the start of our minor revolution here, and that, in of itself, is worth remembering. I think it's also pretty interesting that the source story used for Evil Heart comes from the horror mangaka Kazu Umezu, who I was fairly unfamiliar with before I began researching and writing this particular video. I honestly don't know how, given that this guy is one of the trailblazers who pioneered the horror manga back in the 60s and 70s. That's of interest because I think there is an admittedly unintentional sense of irony in a member of the old guard of horror igniting the new generation. Like a spiritual passing of the torch, almost. I think make this title quite special. I realise I haven't spent a great amount of time during this segment talking about the actual movie itself, but it's a film that coasts on its style and horror more than like the density of its plot or depth of character. So, in short, perfect late night horror viewing. And take a note from the late great David Lynch and don't watch this movie on your
fucking telephone. Get real.
The shit was made for the television screen. Incidentally,
pardon me while I have a strange interlude.
If you watch and like Evil Heart, I would highly recommend the OVA, The Curse of Kazu Umezu, a short horror anime adapting two of his stories that came out just a year or so after this one dropped. It's fun, it's unsettling, it's super homoerotic, and it has that 80s low-budget anime charm that, if you're anything like me, should instantly endear. Alright, let's keep this train rolling and talk about another early V-cinema horror, 1985's The Demon Within. In spite of some creative cinematography, a palpable sense of atmosphere, and some always welcome creature feature style goodness, this one just feels a little underwhelming to me. The languid pacing makes the film feel much, much longer than it actually is, overstaying its welcome even within the confines of the traditionally economic V-cinema jam. The self-serious tone jars with the fun effects work, because the film aims to be quiet, unnerving, tries to get under your skin, only to abruptly pivot towards silly creature feature badness. That's not to suggest that a balance theoretically can't be struck between these two tones, but the film just can't really manage it for me. And it's a real shame, because the stuff with the monster is quite fun at times. Like, think an incredibly low-budget gonzo Gremlins by way of Japanese exploitation cinema, which sounds so good, and I wish this movie just did it a little bit better. Something else of note here, alongside biotherapy, The Demon Within is probably the most indicative of the cross-cultural contamination present in these films. V-cinema wears its influences pretty proudly on its sleeve a lot of the time, but aside from the distinctly Western-feeling creature feature action, there's also a direct reference to The Shining in here towards the end, which is nice. I don't think this is a bad movie by any means. It's not something that is completely unworthy of your time, but I'd be lying if I said I ever intended to return to it in the future. In saying all that though, there is an extended sequence where a woman performs an elaborate dance for the sole benefit of a new pet bird, so I don't know. Maybe take everything I say about this film with a pinch of salt. Now we come to one of my absolute favourite discoveries from this era of V-cinema horror, Psychic Vision Jaganrei. It's an early found footage mockumentary centred around the pop idol industry, and it builds such a powerful sense of unease, real creeping dread, working perfectly in sync with the sensibilities and limitations of V-cinema. The grainy, lo-fi VHS quality really adds to the scare factor here. But in terms of actual horror, the film plays fairly tame, building atmosphere and progressing towards a masterful, chilling climax. I found the film's approach fascinating because of that though. Whereas a lot of the films of this era favour brutality, over-the-top gore effect and full-throttle relentless pacing, Psychic Vision develops slowly, consistently playing with the viewer's expectations and carefully unravelling its central mystery. I like all of the movies I've spoken about up until this point, but this really did impress me and was a very welcome change of pace. Even outside of its approach to creating effective horror, Psychic Vision does operate as a very clear commentary on the cutthroat world of popular music, the exploitation and dehumanization of the idol figures on which it sustains itself, transforming women into commodities, brands, images to be bought and sold. But perhaps this is also a commentary on the emerging state of direct-to-video Japanese cinema. The film, after all, literally opens with a photographer shooting a naked woman, thus highlighting the expectations of sensationalism and sexuality the audience went into these films expecting, to some degree, of course, before then weaponizing those expectations against its audience. Considering that V cinema had only really emerged as a market a couple of years prior, seeing the style already become self-critical is just really interesting to me. Also, the haunted song the movie revolves around, Lovecraft, is an absolute banger. It's a real shame this premium slice of city pop will never hit the market. Have a listen here. Good shit. Next up, we have Daikanyama Wonderland Horror. This is actually from the same director as Psychic Vision, but beamed in from a completely different world. The tonal control and unnerving atmosphere of the former giving way to a delightfully bizarre assortment of music video aesthetics and horror tropes, blasted into your brain in a brief 40 minutes, with all the subtlety and nuance of a sledgehammer through a pane glass window. Now, I have to underline the fact that I couldn't watch this with subtitles, unfortunately, but first of all, if you're going to be getting into these V cinema horror flicks, you're probably going to have to be at peace with the fact that most of them are not going to be a particularly viewer-friendly experience. Of course, I'm referring to the extreme gore and transgressive nature of a lot of these, but also the fact that most of them are going to look like absolute dog shit and will not come with professionally translated subtitles, if they come with subtitles at all. These are trade-offs for sure, but considering how much of a miracle it is that we're actually seeing movies that should probably be dead and buried, the trade-offs that I'm more than willing to accommodate. And secondly, they're hardly essential to the experience in Daikanyama Wonderland Horror. It's an exercise in visual style and just plain fun rather than in narrative. And on these merits, I find it pretty successful, if wildly incoherent. In saying all that, the relative incoherency of the film can partially be attributed to the idea that I do, in fact, not speak a single word of Japanese. But even aside from that, the volatile, strange nature of the film appears to be a feature and not a bug. It's an insane, demented fever dream of a movie. And when I say insane, that isn't hyperbole either. Let me give you a brief rundown of some of the weird shit that happens in this movie. We've got 5 unbroken minutes of aerobics footage that opens the movie, a girl dressed as a cowboy having a shooting showdown with some zombies, discount Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees, an adult baby with a penchant for bloody murder. This film is top to bottom nuts. It's difficult to recommend on the basis of actually being any good, but it is undoubtedly entertaining. You may well be baffled, but you aren't likely to be bored. Ancient curses, Japanese punk, zombies, green smoke. These are just a few of the things that 1987's Youjo Melon will throw at you over the course of 40 truly strange minutes. Now, the really cultured amongst you probably started rubbing your hands together like, yeah boy, and you're right to do so. On the insanity scale, a nationally recognised scale of measurement, I assure you, it's not quite up there with something like Daikanyama Wonderland Horror, but it's no real slouch either. Now, ostensibly, this is a movie about a punk band camping out in an abandoned building to practice their music, and then accidentally awaken a vengeful spirit. But it very quickly becomes apparent that this is somewhat of a promotional video for a real-life punk band, at least as far as I'm aware. In that sense, this is basically the V-cinema equivalent of Japan's own punk zombie odyssey, Wild Zero. And like that movie, this is pretty fun. The effects, whilst limited, are creative, the zombie action is entertaining, and the titular spirit herself is equally menacing and cool. Your mileage on this is going to depend on how much you enjoy underground Japanese punk music and low-budget horror scrappiness, but I imagine you wouldn't have watched this far into a video about V-cinema horror if you couldn't recognise the charm in either. What's also very endearing about the movie is how plugged into the horror underground it is. One of the characters in the movie, upon entering the abandoned warehouse, literally comments that it is just like Guinea Pig.
This place is like a horror movie. It's just like Guinea Pig.
And the film feels very earnest in its appreciation and awareness of the horror world in Japan during this period. Western influence isn't in short supply either, given that there's a scene towards the end that is very reminiscent of Videodrome. Always a welcome sight in my house. Overall then, this is a pretty fun time. Inessential, but entertaining. Now we're going to need to pause and address the elephant in the room. We've been tracing the earliest years of V-cinema horror, but I've danced around this particular entry in the series for as long as I possibly can. Because now we need to talk about Guinea Pig. Spend enough time in horror circles or in discussions of underground and extreme cinema, and the Guinea Pig series is bound to enter the conversation. It's the most infamous export of the V-cinema era, and arguably transcends the notoriety of its own style. I wanted to foreground this video with some films from the same time that get comparatively less attention, but I was always going to have to talk about this series, and that will be for better and for worse. Just for anyone who's not familiar with the series, Guinea Pig was a V-cinema horror series that ran through the mid to late 80s, garnering 6 main entries and amassing a storm of controversy. What is interesting about the series, even when the films happen to be, well, not very good, is the fact that each is radically different from one another, morphing from faux snuff aesthetics to comedy horror to anthology sketch comedy to sci-fi infused horror to something deeply mournful and strangely beautiful in the series' final entry. However, it's the first 2 movies that most of the discussion and infamy seems to centre around, and that's where we're going to start. The Devil's Experiment. To quote the tagline from the slasher classic Pieces,
"It's exactly what you think it is."
Genuinely, this is just grueling, really gruesome stuff. The premise, or framing device if you're feeling particularly charitable, is that of someone receiving a videotape in the mail said to depict the torture and murder of a young woman. An experiment to see how the human body responds to pain. And that's exactly what you get. Honestly, if not for the purposes of this video, I would have turned it off in about 10 minutes in. It's not that The Devil's Experiment is an especially gory or graphic film in this regard compared to the bloodletting of the immediate follow-up, Flowers of Flesh and Blood, and the late series highlight, Mermaid in a Manhole. It's almost pretty tame. But the sustained suffering and torment on display here makes for one of the most unpleasant cinematic experiences I've ever had the displeasure of sitting through. To give some semblance of credit where it's due, the faux snuff aspect of the film is well implemented. This could reasonably be seen as a progenitor of the found footage style, although not to the same degree that Psychic Vision Jaganrei would be a few years later. But I find the film's technical and stylistic merits are mitigated by what a miserable experience it actually is to sit and watch all 40 or so minutes of The Devil's Experiment. And again, I knew what to expect, I saw this coming, but there was nothing of substance here beyond scenes of prolonged torture, a plotless, senseless drudge through graphic depictions of human misery. The follow-up film, whilst being even more gruesome, at least tells the horrific violence to some half-formed social commentary and visual style. Here, there is no such depth, nothing beyond what is immediately seen. Look, if you're already planning to see this movie, my comments are probably not going to deter you. You likely already know exactly the sort of thing you're in for. But I wholeheartedly recommend that everyone else stay far, far away from this thing. And as a viewer, as a critic, as someone who's dedicated a lot of time to the maligned and misunderstood corners of horror, there's really very little positive I can say about this film. Someone with more appreciation for this movie could conceivably make an argument as to its potential artistic merit, but you know what, I really don't care enough to make such an argument. I certainly don't begrudge anyone such an appreciation either. As I said earlier, it's not my place or my role to pass moral judgments on these films. But I also won't pretend there was anything in The Devil's Experiment of value for me. Tread carefully here. very, very carefully. In 1990, Charlie Sheen, the Hollywood actor and star of such spectacles as cinematic violence as Red Dawn, Platoon, and The Wraith, viewed a videotape containing Flowers of Flesh and Blood, an episode from the Japanese Guinea Pig series. Believing it to be a real snuff film, Sheen contacted the Motion Picture Association of America and immediately initiated a crusade dedicated to ensure that the roots of the cinematic flora would never find terra firma on the shelves of US video stores. Although this incident has been recounted so frequently among hardcore aficionados of world horror cinema that, with each retelling, it comes closer and closer to assuming urban legend status, Charlie Sheen and the authorities he alerted are far from the only people who have found themselves compelled to investigate the origin of these controversial texts. In Sweden, police called upon a physician to determine whether an episode of the Guinea Pig series was a recording of an actual or simulated murder. In 1992, a 26-year-old British man named Christopher Berthold was fined £600 for importing the very same guinea pig film that spawned Charlie Sheen's misguided campaign. According to the prosecution in the Berthold case, although the film did not consist of footage from a homicide, it nevertheless fell into the category of a snuff video. These are the opening observations to the chapter on body horror in Japanese horror cinema and Jay McCoy's study of the genre in Nightmare Japan, and are indicative of the cultural impact, the enduring notoriety of this film both in the East and the West. And that reputation, let's say that it's well deserved. Flower of Flesh and Blood pulls no punches, takes no prisoners. It's genuinely disturbing stuff. Now, with that being said, this film is significantly more interesting than The Devil's Experiment, both historically and artistically. We'll discuss the film itself first though, and, fortunately for my own sanity, it's a massive step up from the quality, or lack thereof, of the original entry. Not to suggest that it's great by any means, but it's a welcome improvement nonetheless. The premise is pretty similar to the first film in a lot of ways. The movie's real-life director, the horror manga artist Hideshi Hino, claims he has received a video documenting the torture and murder of a young woman by a man bizarrely clad in samurai garb. As such, naturally, he decides to recreate the footage, which is the videotape that forms the bulk of the movie outside of this expository opening text crawl. Like The Devil's Experiment, Flower of Flesh and Blood uses the faux snuff aesthetics to unnerve the viewer. But to a significantly lesser degree, the film is far more theatrical in nature, and we'll have to stress that neither film is the real deal, of course. The original is far more likely to be mistaken for actual footage of murder than this. Or, you'd think so anyways. For years, without an intimate familiarity of the details of the Sheen story, I believed that the tape he'd actually seen was The Devil's Experiment, but nope. Make of that what you will. This is a much more thorny and difficult entry on a thematic level, I think. A charitable viewer would claim that Flower of Flesh and Blood weaponizes the implicit misogyny of both the film's concept and the series, giving the viewer the gory goodness that they come to a film like this for, but also highlighting it in the context of the real world and real crime. For example, look at the opening text crawl, and the introductory and ending scenes of unsuspecting women being stalked by an unseen, predatory cameraman, made all the more disturbing because we know exactly how this story ends. But let's be honest with ourselves, insightful social commentary is not why the guinea pig movies became notorious, and appropriately, the special effects are the real star of the show here. Tactile, convincing, and incredibly distressing throughout. With that all being said, and despite my preference for this over the abysmal introductory entry, I still can't really make up my mind on this one. Its commitment to its central concept ensures that the vast majority of the runtime is, once again, made up of protracted scenes of torture. However, the atmosphere, bizarre central figure, and a horrifying closing sequence displaying a grotesquerie of decomposing flesh set to droning, echoing poetry from the samurai killer ensure that it is an experience that will stick in the mind beyond the scope of mindless torture. Again, for better and for worse. But as I alluded to earlier, there's another episode in the history of Flower of Flesh and Blood. Although to suggest that The Devil's Experiment was controversial on its home shores when it released in 1985 would be an understatement, the fervour and moral panic surrounding the immediate sequel was on an entirely different level. The incident with Sheen certainly didn't help the film's standing in its home country, but by 1990, the damage was already done. Between 1988 and 1989, a series of murders which will be retrospectively dubbed the Otaku murders were committed by the Japanese serial killer Tsutomu Miyazaki, who abducted and mutilated 4 young girls. I'm going to be light on details here given the abhorrent nature of these crimes. If you want to find out more, that information is out there, but please be careful about doing your own research here. Upon arresting Miyazaki, police officers found thousands of videotapes in the killer's apartment, a mixture of anime, horror movies, pornography, and, of course, guinea pig, Flower of Flesh and Blood. As a result, the country descended into a moral panic over the graphic content of such home video releases, with Flower of Flesh and Blood at its centre. For anybody who is familiar at all with film history in the UK, is probably drawing similar parallels between Japan's panic and the ones that occurred following the Hungerford massacre in 1987, where the Rambo films were used as an explanation for Michael Ryan's shooting of 16 victims in Hungerford, and especially the James Bulger case in 1993, the murder of a young child said to have been inspired by the young killer's supposed viewing of Child's Play 3 on VHS, which again resulted in the country erupting into a moral panic over the violent content present in contemporary horror films. In discussing these 3 cases, of which there are, unfortunately, numerous other examples occurring across history, the single parallel that I intend to draw is that of horror fiction being demonized, that of real-life tragedies being twisted into excuses to control and censor. After all, it is much more difficult to hold society or culture to account, much more difficult to face that sometimes genuinely horrible things just happen. Much easier to simply blame the horror film and move on. He Never Dies is a pretty definitive turning point for the series, at which it becomes less abrasive, less dangerous, focusing more on a ludicrous gore comedy. Such a stylistic shift can be attributed to the change in production companies which occurred between the releases of Flower and this film. It was Orange Video House who produced the first 2 films, but duties were handed over to Japan Home Video, or JHV, who picked up the rights and sold the series out with its final 4 entries. Quick editor's note here, this is actually wrong. Editing this video at stupid o'clock in the morning, I decided to look through my copy of Guinea Pig 3 and was taken aback to see not Japan Home Video, but a label called Midnight 25. This massively sort of, it threw me off a little bit, so after doing a bit more research, as it turns out, Orange Video House released original productions on micro labels, one of which being Midnight 25, and given the name, I have to go ahead and assume that's all specialized in horror or whatever. So yeah, the first 4 productions were handled by Orange Video House. After that, they ceased to be a producer, and that's handed over to Japan Home Video. I clearly just read that on the internet somewhere. It sounded right given the order of the movies and the stylistic shift that occurred. I can only assume they pivoted towards comedy given the sort of controversy around Devil's Experiment, but who's to say? I'm going to keep the previous segment in for posterity. I don't think it's fair to, we need the proof that I was a dumbass, which, is the case, but yeah, the shift doesn't happen until Android and Note Dame. So there we go. Overall, this is a fine film, one which centers around a depressed Japanese salaryman who discovers that he, cannot die. It's admittedly amusing, but it doesn't have the budget or the scope to sustain its absurd concept. This is easily the shortest entry in the series at a mere 40 minutes. And keep in mind that a number of those 40 minutes are taken up by end credits, a blooper reel, and these completely unnecessary wraparound segments involving a doctor discussing the medical miracle of the man who cannot die. It seems strange that after talking about flour for so long, I have comparatively less to say about this entry. But that does mean we can move on to Devil Doctor Woman, or Devil Woman Doctor, depending on who you ask. It's complicated. But this one is absolutely absurd, leaning into the comedic in the same way that He Never Dies does, but in practice it acts way more like a psychotic Monty Python if they had ingested nothing but gore movies for the last 3 years and worshipped at the altar of Frank Henlotter. Not to suggest that the quality is the same as its lofty influences. The sketches swing between being quite amusing, to unremarkable, to fairly poor. But the unpredictability of the whole thing keeps it engaging throughout, even if it's not exactly a V-cinema horror highlight. In saying that, this definitely seemed like a fun movie to work on, which I can appreciate. The film's loose collection of gore sketches closes out with the cast and crew covering each other in fake blood and laughing to the stirring score of Vivaldi. And the film's sense of fun extends to its central figure, the titular Devil Doctor Woman, played by drag icon Shinosuke Aikihata, more commonly known as Peter. If that name rings a vague bell, it probably should, considering the man has starred in Japanese films like Funeral Parade of Roses and Akira Kurosawa's seminal Ran. Those, of course, being mere demo reels in comparison to Devil Doctor Woman. In all seriousness, Aikihata gives the role his all, imbuing the character with a palpable sense of theatrical relish. He's a joy to watch on screen, and it's worth experiencing the film just for his performance. Fun, fun, fun. Our next guinea pig movie, I shit you not, is called The Android of Notre Dame. And appropriately, this is such a strange little movie. I appreciate the attempts to engage with the emerging strain of underground cyberpunk cinema in Japan, even at the point of featuring Tetsuo the Iron Man himself, but the result feels half-hearted at best and a little cheap at worst. There's no engagement with the themes that define the subgenre, and the film's visual style, whilst not poor by any means, feels underdeveloped, to say the least. The plot is generally bland and just feels a little dull. The Guinea Pig series has always evolved with each subsequent entry, but it's hard not to see some fatigue here. The violence lacks the dangerous, immediate, transgressive edge of the earliest entries, and the black comic sensibilities of subsequent films. Throw in the science fiction setting and some underdeveloped literary allusions, and what emerges is a confused, unusual mess of a movie. Despite saying all that though, despite Android's identity crisis and lack of momentum, I can't really bring myself to hate this one, even if it is quite a bad movie. It's altogether too strange to dismiss entirely. Shit like characters thrusting around bizarre lines of dialogue, and just really odd curveball moments, make for a memorable, if not consistently engaging, watch. This might not be the worst of the Guinea Pig movies, in fact it's definitely not the worst of the Guinea Pig movies, but it is probably the most inessential. Definitely difficult to recommend outside the interests of completionism. Finally, last but not least, we have Mermaid in Manhole. And I'm gonna let you all in on a little secret here. This is the best one. Hideshi Hino turns a simple, gnarly gore movie about a man and his mermaid into symbolism for the individual's relationship with art, the capacity of that art to help the artist deal with loss and pain, however poorly, and an allegory for the continual corruption of the natural world in the face of industrialization and progress. If a film like Tetsuo the Iron Man is the natural conclusion of such progress, this is the decay that led to that end. The film never pretends that its titular mermaid stands a chance, instead simply asking to be remembered through the painter's art. The film is almost a southern requiem for something lost, a reminder of what cannot be regained. And the gore effects are terrific, of course, appropriately bloody and gooey, genuinely just grotesque stuff. It's pretty clear that this is where most of the budget went, and it was money that was very well spent. But unlike the gore-focused films that precede it, atmosphere is a real strength of the film. The music flits between airy, hazy synths and more unnerving ambient compositions, always complementing the feel of the film whilst never overwhelming it. I'm particularly fond of the music which introduces the mermaid. Simple but effective in conjuring that mystic, elusive sense of something magical, something that is slowly slipping away. The film's visual style helps here immensely. The condensed apartment space and sewers are well defined, detailed, and the lighting choices feel a lot more like giallo than a lot of what this film's contemporaries had to offer. Again, it sounds a little glib to say that this is the good one, especially considering that I had positive things to say about most of the entries in this video. But if you're only going to check out a single film from the series, Mermaid in a Manhole should definitely be it. A fusion of spectacular special effects and thoughtful environmental themes. A true classic of V cinema horror. Okay, I know I said we were finished with the Guinea Pig series, and technically that is the case. 1989's Lucky Sky Diamond is somewhat of an anomaly for the series, given that it's an unofficial entry that has remained tethered to the series since, without having ever actually been a part of it. There's likely a few reasons for this. Series producer and director of The Devil's Experiment, Satoru Ogara, was credited as having produced this entry. Given the overlap in tone and style, it also makes sense that mail-order catalogues would then confuse this for another entry in the long-running and diverse series. The video was also produced by Japan Home Video, the company that took over production duties for Guinea Pig after Devil Doctor Woman. With all this in play, and the relative scarcity of information surrounding obscure underground horror movies at the time, especially in the West, it's easy to see how the Guinea Pig label was applied and has stuck around since. As we know pretty definitively that it isn't a part of the series, maybe I'm doing it a disservice by not examining it on its own merits, but its legacy and notoriety is so tied to the Guinea Pig series that it seems silly not to acknowledge the enduring connection. As for the movie itself, well, I don't want to just be dismissive and say, haha, this movie is weird, am I right guys? Because, well, yes, this is the most bizarre and abrasive entry of the series, it feels reductive to not try and approach it with the same openness that I have all the other movies in this video. That being said though, I really struggled to parse just what was going on, what it was all meant to mean. The film's haze of elevator music and brain surgery and grainy television screens all make for a, shall we say, unique viewing experience, but I find very little cohesion between its disparate elements, and you end up with a cacophony of noise and gore that, quite frankly, struggled to keep my interest. I do think that this is a more interesting film than its uniformly negative reputation would ultimately suggest. Put it this way, it's better than a couple of entries in this series, but I don't know, it's fine. More than a historical curiosity, lesser than the talent who came together to realise it. Oh yeah, I didn't mention, the film's director, Izuo Hashimoto. Japanese horror acolytes will probably recognise him as the director of the sequel to the excellent Evil Dead Trap, which, despite the stylistic overlap with the cinema, was a theatrical release and unfortunately exempt from discussion here. But he also helped to write Akira. You know, that 80s anime movie that revolutionised the industry and broke anime in the West? I mean, you might have heard of it, it's pretty obscure though. And yeah, that's it for the Guinea Pig series as a whole. We can all breathe a collective sigh of relief. But there's a reason I've structured this video in such a way where Guinea Pig ends up in the centre. Do you remember the media storm surrounding the Miyazaki case and its relation to Flower and Flesh and Blood? Yeah, well, that had some big consequences for V cinema horror as a whole. You'll remember that the press dubbed the case, amongst other things, the otaku murders, and this idea emerged that the state of being an otaku, i.e. being someone with a deep passion for anime, horror movies, or some other facet of popular culture, was intrinsically linked to harbouring issues of mental illness, psychopathy, and, ultimately, the innate capacity to commit crimes similar to the ones Miyazaki perpetrated in the late 80s. Being an otaku, having what was perceived as an abnormal interest in anime and horror movies, began to be perceived as incredibly negative, and there was quite a while in Japan where the term was used as a pejorative. As such, V cinema horror essentially had to retreat into the underground. The films we'll be looking at from the 90s in a moment aren't necessarily always less extreme or transgressive than the mid-80s counterparts, especially when we hit the late 90s with the work of filmmakers like Daisuke Yamaguchi, but there is a distinct shift in direction. We begin to see the seeds being planted for what will eventually become the J-horror boom. We begin to see the rise of larger companies trying their hand at this emerging market, with Toei's actual V-Cinema label being unveiled in 1989. There are still violent, gore-heavy movies, but rarely are they presented in the same manner that they were before the Miyazaki murders. There are also some economic circumstances that might play into this, but you're probably fucking sick of hearing about the 20th century Japanese economy at this point. But I do think that the new decade was the beginning of a shift for the cinema horror, and it wouldn't ever really be exactly the same again. Emblematic of a lot of what I've just spoken about is 1991's Scary True Stories.
I can think of at least 2 things wrong with that title.
A fairly toothless ghostly horror anthology which aims for a sense of creeping dread and largely just conjures up boredom. To say that the film was entirely born out of the complex cultural state Japan found itself in during the early 90s would probably be overstating my case a little bit, but it's difficult not to see just how significantly the winds have changed in the new decade. So that leads to the question, why is Scary True Stories even in this video? I watched plenty of V-Cinema horror that didn't make it into this video, either for the sake of time and my sanity, or because I simply didn't have all that much to say about them overall. So why this one? Well, it's here because this is one of the most important Japanese horror movies of the early 90s. That sounds like an exaggeration, I know, but nope. This is the Rosetta Stone for the J-horror boom in the late 90s, and Norio Tsurata distills the essential elements of that style down into a 40-minute horror anthology that would arguably provide the blueprint for that style going forward. Jay McRoy speaks about the film's influence in Nightmare Japan. In the 1980s, Japanese horror was painted in bright streaks of red, spurting from gashing wounds and blood-spouting intestinal spillings, a far cry from the late 1990s films filled with young women simply standing there with hair hanging over their face. The shift from bloody spectacle to intense atmospheric tension, based on showing less, was initiated by a barely known director originating from Japan's straight-to-video world, usually called V-Cinema. Norio Tsurata not only turned the horror methodology around by 180 degrees, but also established extremely successful and resilient storylines and iconography, influencing all the big names in Japanese horror film today, yes, all, and ultimately leading to the worldwide J-horror boom and spate of American remakes. I do think he overgeneralizes the early V-Cinema scene a little bit. As we've seen, there were movies that focused more on atmosphere and tension than indulging in blood and gore, but he eloquently states the case for the film's enduring influence, and how the Japanese horror industry at large would follow suit in the coming year. If you've watched and enjoyed films like Ringu or Ju-on the Grudge, they can be traced back to what Tsurata does in Scary True Stories. Which is why the film's relatively middling quality doesn't really present much of an issue for me. Pioneers and trailblazers are not going to perfect the formula their first go round. As such, even if the film stories are not particularly scary or true, the groundwork that was laid out here for Japan's horror future, which then itself went on to influence some of the defining horror trends overseas in the early 2000s, more than makes this worth acknowledgement here. The circumstances in which the film was created are arguably just as interesting as the cinematic revolution it would indirectly inspire. According to David Kalat's J-Horror, the definitive guide to The Ring, The Grudge and Beyond, Tsurata was browsing in a bookstore when a manga caught his eye. The thing was called Scary True Stories, a compilation of true-life encounters with ghosts. It would not be hard or expensive to realise on video. The short vignettes would put few demands on actors, and special effects were limited. In all, a V-Cinema adaptation would be a minor risk, and it was just the sort of thing Japan Home Video was looking to do. Before pitching the idea to his bosses though, Surata wanted to have the cards in his favour. He had no directing experience and didn't want to give them an excuse to greenlight the idea but exclude him. So, the young man approached the manga's publisher and asked for the rights. They agreed and didn't ask for any money. Japan Home Video happily agreed to take a chance on the untested director and apparently even gave him total Orson Welles style auteur responsibilities over every detail, even down to approving his own video covers. And while we didn't exactly get Citizen Kane, it's fascinating to see just how much freedom young filmmakers could have in V-Cinema before the Japanese economy imploded in the early 90s. Surata would continue working in the direct-to-video format for the following decade, even directing 2 more anthology follow-ups to Scary True Stories, which I unfortunately did not have time to watch for the purposes of this video. I sure hope you haven't gotten sick of hearing about Tetsuo the Iron Man over the course of this video, because here comes yet another V-Cinema title with clear ties to Tsukamoto's masterpiece. Between that and David Cronenberg's own Videodrome, Anatomia Extinction's influences are pretty clear, but I think it fuses these influences with its own personality to create a short slice of body horror that is still worth your time. Anatomia Extinction is low budget, hazy, sludgy horror, drenched in dark neon lights and steadily progressing towards a fairly memorable, explosive conclusion. Apparently, this is something of a smaller test run for the director's most notorious project, Tokyo Gore Police, which, as of right now, I'm a little ashamed to say I haven't actually seen. And yes, I imagine I enjoy Tokyo Gore Police, but in fairness, I've been holed up in my room for a month in the dark watching long-forgotten direct-to-VHS Japanese splatter movies, whilst everyone I live with wonders,
Good Lord, what is happening in there?
So I think I have a valid excuse for having not seen it quite just yet. Regardless though, Anatomia Extinction easily stands on its own merits. An example that latter period V-Cinema horror could still deliver the goods. Well worth the 50-minute investment. Taking the unofficial award for having the best title on this list, and let's face it, it's not even really that close, Bloody Muscle Bodybuilder in Hell is arguably one of the most fascinating films in this video. Because, for starters, it shouldn't even really be here. This micro-budget Evil Dead homage was filmed in the mid-90s, but wasn't actually edited and released until at least a decade later. By my own admission, this isn't technically V-Cinema, but it rips. It rips so much that it would be silly not to include it here. Sure, it has the slow build-up that kinda makes the first half a little bit of a slog at times, but as soon as that second half hits, you're in for a great time. Gnarly practical effects, fun one-liners, the titular bodybuilder, played by the film's director Shinichi Fukuzawa, just oozing charisma throughout. Look, there's only one way to describe it.
Groovy.
What I appreciate most about Bodybuilder is that it's bound to satisfy pretty much every Evil Dead fan as well. If you prefer the grimy, darker, exploitation-esque atmosphere of the original, this film has it. Conversely, if you prefer the gore comedy and sheer boundless energy of the sequel, first of all, you have good taste, but you will also be eating very well with this movie. This is probably one of the most easily accessible movies in this video. It's everywhere, I'm pretty sure it's on Shudder at the moment, so check it out, it's a great time.
Baby.
For being the supposed king of late 90s scuzzy, exploitative V-Cinema horror, it feels a little bit weird to only have a single Daisuke Yamanuchi film in this video. Admittedly, I did have a short section about Red Room in my original draft, but omitted it because of how fucking boring that movie is. Sorry to all the Red Room fans out there, or 3 of you. Luckily, in the same year, he gave us a much better movie in the form of Celluloid Nightmares, a compelling pseudo-documentary following an investigation into the mysterious disappearance of an adult film actress. The best way to summarise this is that it's like the evil twin to Psych Vision Jaganrei. And what I mean by this is that the film similarly uses found footage filmmaking techniques to create an immersive horror experience that also happens to be one of the most distressing horror movies I've seen in recent memory. Like, okay, other than the first 2 guinea pig movies, this is the most grueling cinematic experience on this list, and I honestly cannot recommend it to anyone in conscience without making that abundantly clear. But it is also really, really good. Borderline experimental and cutting edge in many places too, which on the face of it sounds absolutely ludicrous, especially for a movie that explores the pornography industry with about as much subtlety and restraint as you could reasonably expect from Yamanouchi. Genuinely though, this is a great movie. The mystery unravels in such a way that remains engaging throughout. The mockumentary format heightens the tension and works well with the grainy, muddy VHS aesthetic the movie operates within. And it's almost impressive how brazenly exploitative it is. Like, as an example, this rips the countdown warning gimmick from Gaspar Noé's early movie I Stand Alone, which I think came out around a year prior to this. In both cases, the audience are warned of the incoming violence and are given a set amount of time to either leave the theatre or turn off their television screens. Again, from what I've seen of his work, Yamanouchi is a bit of an edgelord provocateur, but I cannot deny how effectively this technique is used here. You know, at this point in the film, I straight up could not move from my seat, terrified to look at the screen, but just as terrified to look away. Also, the ending, Christ. I'm gonna put that countdown up before I talk about the ending. Like, this thing definitely influenced Sonsono's anti-porno, right? Because the whole it was all a film shoot conceit is given away far earlier in that film, but there's too much overlap in subject matter and thematic implication for it to be a coincidence. Regardless though, this is a twist of the highest order, pulling the camera back and pointing it squarely at the audience and society as a whole. This revelation is chilling in its implications. The idea that everything that has occurred is in itself part of the narrative for an adult film is disorientating enough. But the fact that there is an audience, a market for such content is what truly lingers. Again, this isn't a subtle film, not in the slightest, but it's the blatantness with which this message is delivered that makes it so effective. Not an easy watch by any stretch of the imagination, but it's one I can recommend if you have the stomach for it. The dawn of the new millennium brought with it Ju-on the Curse, an effective, low-budget shocker with a focus on ghostly revenge and haunting atmospheres. There's very little benefit in playing too coy here, given that this is one of the films in this video that you're probably already acquainted with, given its bigger budget remake in 2002's Ju-on the Grudge. In retrospect, it's difficult to see The Curse as anything else but a minor prototype of a future J-horror classic. But, that being said, The Curse was there to pave the way for that film's success, and its solid scares and twisty narrative still ensure that it's an entertaining watch. That narrative, which takes on a non-linear structure, leaping between characters with title cards bearing their names appearing at the beginning of each segment, provides much of the film's intrigue, as the viewer takes on the task of piecing together the film's stories with the clues they are given, the pieces slowly but surely falling into place as the narrative progresses. One of the film's key failings, admittedly, is that character feels a little incidental at times, people being introduced only to be killed off approximately 5 minutes later, having left very little impact between their introductions and their deaths, but that sense of intrigue in the film's brief runtime keep that guessing game engaging throughout. If this all sounds a little familiar to you, that same structure reappeared in this year's summer hit, Weapons. So if you liked it there, you've probably got this low-budget V-cinema horror film to thank. The Curse is also pretty interesting in retrospect, given that it's one of the films that has both benefited and suffered from the notoriety of its remake, which has made it inarguably one of the easiest films to find on this list. You know, not least because Arrow released a double box set of all the movies on Blu-ray a few years back, which, of course, is neat. I'm glad this movie is easily accessible. I'm definitely glad V-cinema is being recognised in the West. But part of me does think that films like The Curse benefited immensely from the technical limitations of video. The Curse was made to be watched late at night. The viewer crouched inches from the television screen, grain and snow settling over the image, distorting them as the slow, dim hum of the VCR player whirs in the background. That's the ideal way to see a lot of these movies, the time and the atmosphere that they were specifically designed for. These films aren't any different, of course, for being watched in the present, but it's difficult not to shake the impression that a little something has been lost in the process. abandoned to the passage of time and the progress of technology. And in all honesty, I think this is where our ride with the V cinema horror comes to somewhat of an end. Not definitively, of course, given that there was still the odd title produced for the market after the year 2000. Takashi Miike being a very notable director who continued to champion the form, using it for projects like Visitor Q and Gozu that probably would have really struggled to obtain any sort of theatrical release. And with the advent of DVD in the mid-90s, as it began to replace home video as the dominant format, there just wasn't really a place for V cinema horror like there had been around 15 years prior. The cultural and artistic circumstances that conspired to cause its creation just weren't a factor anymore. And perhaps even more importantly, the rise of J-horror, which in of itself got its start in V cinema horror, had now overtaken the demand for the presiding V cinema style. Japan's major horror exports and successes weren't solely confined to home video anymore. They were now dominating theatres and setting the rest of the world on fire, with titles like Ringu, Ju-on the Grudge, Dark Water, and Pulse, all exemplifying the J-horror style. So I again have to ask myself the question, why V cinema? Why spend actual weeks losing significant amounts of sleep writing and researching a video on direct-to-video horror that barely anybody gave enough of a shit about to even talk about on this website? A video that will inevitably be demonetized and may not even make it to publication. There's a pretty simple answer to that.
You're stupid!
More than that though, I think it's precisely because there is very little coverage of direct-to-video horror cinema in the West. And what is out there is limited to academic publications, internet forums, and the same 7 dudes on Letterboxd writing detailed reviews for The Human-Faced Dog or something like that. This stuff is cool, it's weird, it's abrasive, and it plays by its own rules. It's not even that good the majority of the time, but it still deserves to be documented and remembered in some capacity. And now, these films are more easily accessible than they have ever been. No longer do you have to worry about importing a copy of Guinea Pig on video and being put on fucking trial for it. Archivers and fansubbers have ensured that a lot of these movies are no longer lost to the abyss, and the internet has ensured that they can be found and watched by anybody with a computer and the inclination to do just a little bit of digging. That's not to say the current climate is ideal. A great many of these movies are just unable to be seen on Western shores, or at least are incredibly difficult to track down. And official modern releases can be a little limited, to say the least. But I consider myself to be very lucky to have been able to see even a handful of the movies I've talked about here, much less all of them. What's insane is that the movies that I cover in this video don't even begin to cover the amount of V cinema horror that's floating around the internet, never mind the stuff that just hasn't been archived or is straight up lost. In horror especially, there's always a notion floating around that the past is the best place to be, the idealised sense that the supposed glory days have passed us by. But the best time, really, is right now. More weird, interesting shit is at your fingertips than ever before, just waiting for rediscovery, waiting for somebody to take a chance on uncovering some cool little V cinema banger. Occupying so much time at the margins of horror over the past month or so has, more often than not, been a really rewarding experience, because it's demonstrated just how wide and fascinating a lot of this stuff can actually be. And if someone's going to tell you that watching obscure direct-to-video Japanese horror isn't worth your time, you were just too cool to hang out with them anyways. Check out some of these films, make your own discoveries, and just take a chance with the things that you watch. Because you might find something awesome that you would have never stumbled onto otherwise. Okay, if you have made it this far into this behemoth of a video, I'd like to thank you so much for watching. This was a monster to create and finish, and I sincerely hope that you've enjoyed this trip into the one-of-a-kind bizarro world of V-cinema horror. And if that is the case, please do show your support by subscribing. Let's face it, I really don't think YouTube is going to like the video where I talk about underground Japanese horror movies for an hour, so any help would be greatly appreciated. Firstly, as part of these post-video ramblings, I'd like to discuss a little bit of inspiration that helped in conceptualizing and realizing this video. Because if you like this video, you have Hazel's video on direct-to-video anime to thank for it. To the point where, when I was writing and researching my own stuff early on, I began to worry that this video would be too similar to that one. As I continued, I realized that this wasn't the case, but I'd still find it disingenuous not to point that inspiration out. And if you liked this, you've probably already seen that video, but it's a great watch, check it out. Another note, I said it in the main video, but I'll say it again, I really couldn't have done this without the effort of the archivers and the fansubbers who rescued a lot of these old tapes and allowed people to actually see them again. They do great and very underappreciated work, and I want to wholeheartedly thank them because they made this project possible. And one more thing, I'll admit, I wasn't really sure about this video. Calling V-cinema horror a niche subject is quite the understatement, and I've been uncertain the whole way through about whether I should continue with the project or whether it should even go up on the channel, given that it is substantially different to pretty much everything I've done before, in both style and content. That being said, I feel happier with this now that it's finished, and again, just hope that you all enjoyed it. So, good night. I'm gonna go play some Pokemon and sleep for a month.